Question 79 of the Summa Theologia is the fifth question in the Treatise on Man, the Treatise on Human Nature. And I also have to think, the longer I study St. Thomas Aquinas and the Summa, I begin to kind of get into the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas. And I really think this is probably what he would consider one of the most important questions in the Summa. Now, there are 13 articles, so this is going to be kind of a long one, but I do encourage you to stick with this whole video because this is very foundational. St. Thomas Aquinas says that the intellect is the most important faculty of the human person. It's the most important part of our soul, and here he's going to ask 13 questions related to the human intellect. And so if you possibly can, do stick with me throughout this whole video, and I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible. In fact, Article 1 I can get through very quickly. He says whether the intellect is a power of the soul. And he says, yes, it's a power of the soul because the intellect isn't the soul, because it's just a power of the soul. It's something only God is the being whose power is also his essence, which is also everything else all kind of lumped together. But no creature has a faculty like the intellect as being anything other than one of the powers of his soul. So there you go. Article 1 is down. It gets a little more complicated as we go through this. But again, these are some really interesting questions that he asks about this. Whether the intellect is a passive power. And he says, in a wide sense, a thing is said to be passive from the very fact that it is in potentiality to receive that to which it is in potentiality. Okay, this is extremely important in the history of philosophy because people like Immanuel Kant are going to come along and say that the intellect isn't really a passive power, it's more of an active power where we kind of, through categories, construct the form of things where the world is conforming to us rather than we conforming to the world. So this is actually very important for Aquinas to say that our intellect is in passivity and potentiality. And he says, accordingly, whatever passes from potentiality to act may be said to be passive, even when it is perfected. And thus it is with us to understand is to be passive. This is so fundamental, so important, because what it ultimately means is that we are passively receiving what God has planted into the world to reveal himself to us. So the passivity is not any kind of weakness in us. What it is, it's an understanding that God is revealing himself to us in the created world, and we're passive to that. We're receiving it rather than constructing it, like Immanuel Kant would say centuries after St. Thomas Aquinas. For the intellect, as we have said above, has an operation extending to universal being. We may therefore see whether the intellect be an act or potentiality by observing, first of all, the nature of the relation of the intellect to universal being. For we find an intellect whose relation to universal being is that of the act of all being. I think you know who he's getting at here, and that is the divine intellect. So remember, God knows everything. God has the knowledge of all things. He created all things. He's the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause. He is existence itself. And so the world is a reflection of the divine intellect. Okay, which is the essence of God, in which originally and virtually all being preexists as in its first cause. And therefore, the divine intellect is not in potentiality, but is pure act. Okay, the pure act of being. That's a great definition of God. But no created intellect can be an act in relation to the whole universal being. Otherwise, it would needs be an infinite being. Even the angels have potentiality. They're not pure act, right? Wherefore, every created intellect is not the act of all things intelligible by reason of its very existence, but is compared to those intelligible things as potentiality to act. All right, this is so beautiful. It's so fundamental that we understand this, that we are in potentiality to learning about God through the created world. The things that we come to know teach us about God. And then he says, here, wherefore the angelic intellect is always in act as regard those things which it can understand by reason of its proximity to the first intellect, which is pure act, as we have said above. But the human intellect, which is the lowest in the order of intelligence, how's that for keeping us humble, and most remote from the perfection of the divine intellect, is in potentiality with regard to things intelligible, and is at first like a clean tablet on which nothing is written. Now that's Aristotle saying that, but centuries later, John Locke is going to take that line and create empiricism, which is going to go down a dark path with Hume and Berkeley and create an absolute mess. Of course, Kant was influenced by Hume. And so Aristotle was right in this because Aristotle had a good understanding of it. But the empiricists, man, they took this and went in a whole different direction with it. This is made clear by the fact that at first we are only in potentiality to understand, and afterwards we are made to understand actually. Oh, that's so important. Is there an active intellect? Nothing is reduced from potentiality to act except by something in act as the essence as made actual by what is actually sensible. We must therefore assign on the part of the intellect some power to make things actually intelligible by abstraction of the species from material conditions. And such is the necessity of the active intellect. Now, active intellect. There will be more to say about the active intellect, but these are two powers of the intellect that work together. The passive intellect is in potentiality to universal being, right? So we can really know all things, but we are still in potentiality because only God is the pure active being. But it's the active intellect that goes out and encounters through the senses the physical world and abstracts the phantasms and comes to know these things as universals, and by doing so begins to little by little understand more about God. This is really important. Whether the active intellect is something in the soul. The active intellect of which the philosopher speaks is something in the soul. In order to make this evident, we must observe that above the intellectual soul of man, we must needs suppose a superior intellect. Whose intellect do you think that is? From which the soul acquires the power of understanding. Remember, we're totally dependent on God. Only through God can we come to know things, and as we come to know these things, we're coming to know Him. For what is such by participation, and what is mobile, and what is imperfect, always requires the preexistence of something essentially such, immovable and perfect. Immovable, perfect, eternal. This goes back to the pre-Socratics, before Socrates. They discovered and they came up with this idea of the logos. All right, there's something perfect, there's something eternal, there's something immutable, despite all the flux and all the change in the world. Even before Jesus Christ, the logos, the pre-Socratics recognized this, and this is what St. Thomas Aquinas is talking about. Now, the human soul is called intellectual by reason of a participation in intellectual power. Moreover, it reaches to the understanding of truth by arguing with a certain amount of reasoning and movement, okay? Discursiveness. Little by little, we're figuring things out, and we're learning a lot about God. Okay, oops, I messed up here. I got to go back to 4. Jump to the gun there. Now, among these lower... Okay, wherefore we must say that in the soul is some power derived from a higher intellect, whereby it is able to light up the phantasms. Light up the phantasms. We'll more on that in a future question. And we know this by experience, since we perceive that we abstract universal forms from their particular conditions, which is to make them actually intelligible. I will prove this to you right now. I'm going to hold this up, and every single person watching right now thought in their mind, pen. Pen. This is a particular pen, but you universalized it, and you lumped it together with every other pen you've ever experienced in your life. That's the universal of penness, right? That's what he's talking about. It's natural to us. Therefore, the power which is the principle of this action must be something in the soul. For this reason, Aristotle compared the active intellect to light. When a light comes on, we see what's in the darkness, which is something received into the air, while Plato compared the separate intellect impressing the soul to the sun, which brightens the day and we see things through the sun, right? And then, but the separate intellect, according to the teaching of our faith, is God himself, who is the soul's creator and only beatitude, okay? It's only through God that we come to know these things. God allows us to participate in his very existence and his very being. Whether the active intellect is one and all. All right, so this active intellect that lights up all the phantasms and helps us to understand and come to knowledge of things, is it the same thing in everybody? Is it the same one? Thomas says, for if the active intellect were not something belonging to the soul, but were some separate substance, there would be one active intellect. But if the active intellect is something belonging to the soul, which we already determined it is, as one of its powers, we are bound to say that there are as many active intellects as there are souls, which are multiplied according to the number of men. For it is impossible that one same power belongs to various substances. So you have an active intellect, I have an active intellect. They operate similarly, and they light up phantasms, and they help us learn things and turn potentiality into act, but they are different. Question number 6, whether memory is in the intellectual part of the soul. And he says, for what is received into something is received according to the condition of the recipient. This is very important. We receive things according to the mode of our ability to know. That's why you and your dog can look at the periodic table of elements and you're going to get something different out of it because the dog doesn't have the ability to process the way you are. But the intellect is of a more stable nature and is more immovable than corporeal nature. Thus, therefore, if we take memory only for the power of retaining species, we must say that it is in the intellectual part. But if in the notion of memory we include its object as something past, then the memory is not in the intellectual, but only in the sensitive part, which apprehends individual things. For past, as past, since it signifies being under a condition of fixed time, is something individual. Let me just pause real quickly and say that the intellect understands universals, penness, dogness, frogness. The senses see particulars. So if you had a memory of your third grade teacher, that's not person universally, that's Mrs. Smith or Mrs. Morris, right? That's a particular person. It's in the senses. If you had a memory of a frog you caught when you were 5 years old, that was a particular frog. That wasn't frogness. You didn't catch frogness. You caught a particular frog, and that's what he's getting at here. Whether the intellectual memory is a power distinct from the intellect. And he says, this is a little bit confusing. This is one of the more challenging ones. The active power is compared to its object as being in act is to be in potentiality, whereas the passive power, on the contrary, is compared to its object as being in potentiality is to being in act. Remember, the passive intellect is in potentiality to all things, universal being. The active intellect is the one that goes out and kind of lights it up, and we come to know it, right, through the active intellect. Therefore, there can be no other difference of powers in the intellect but that of passive and passive and active. Wherefore, it is clear that memory is not a distinct power from the intellect, for it belongs to the nature of a passive power to retain as well as to receive. So potentially, we are remembering all the things that we have experienced in our life. Is reason distinct from intellect? Reason and intellect in man cannot be distinct powers. We shall understand this clearly if we consider their respective actions. For to understand is simply to apprehend intelligible truth, and to reason is to advance from one thing understood to another so as to know an intelligible truth. It's like the difference between us and angels. Angels are infused with intelligible truth, intelligible species. We, on the other hand, come to know things little by little. We didn't have anything infused in us when we were born. When we were born, we were quite ignorant, right? But we learn things as we go along, little by little and discursively. And therefore, angels who, according to their nature, possess perfect knowledge of intelligible truth, have no need to advance from one thing to another, but apprehend the truth simply and without mental discussion. But man arrives at the knowledge of intelligible truth by advancing from one thing to another, and therefore he is called rational. Reasoning, therefore, is compared to understanding as movement to rest. The angels rest because they got it all, right? We move because we're imperfect and we're the lowest of the intelligent substances, of which one belongs to the perfect and the other to the imperfect. Human reasoning, by way of inquiry and discovery, advances from certain things simply understood, namely the first principles, and again, by way of judgment, returns by analysis to first principles, in the light of which it examines what it has found. First principles are things that we know naturally, like the whole is greater than its parts, things like that we don't have to kind of figure out, but they're just kind of common sense, right? And so it is clear that in man, reason and intellect are the same power. Article 9, whether the higher and lower reason are distinct powers. There's a higher and a lower reason. The higher and lower reason, as they are understood by Augustine, can in no way be two powers of the soul, for he says that the higher reason is that which is intent on the contemplation and consultation of things eternal. The contemplation of truth, the contemplation of God as the eternal being, right? Meditation, contemplation. But he calls the lower reason that which is intent on the disposal of temporal things. Now these two, namely eternal and temporal, are related to our knowledge in this way, that one of them is the means of knowing the other. For by way of discovery we come through knowledge of temporal things to that of things eternal. Oh, that is so beautiful. You see what he's saying? Is that through our experience of the temporal, of the changeable, we come to an understanding of the eternal. That's what the pre-Socratics discovered. That's the Logos. The Logos is eternal. They said, you know what? All these things are changing, but there's got to be something stable, something that doesn't change. And according to the words of the Apostle Paul, the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. While by way of judgment from eternal things already known, we judge of temporal things, and according to laws of things eternal, we dispose of temporal things. So he's saying, in some ways, we come to know the temporal through the eternal. In some ways, it's the other way around. Article 10, whether intelligence is a power distinct from intellect. The word intelligence properly signifies the intellect's very act, which is to understand. However, in some works translated from the Arabic, the separate substances which we call angels are called intelligences, and perhaps for this reason, that such substances are always actually understanding. But in works translated from the Greek, they are called intellects or minds. So these are different names that different cultures refer to with the angels, right? Because they're intellectual and they have intelligence because it's all infused into them. For sometimes they assign four intellects: the active, the passive intellects, the intellect in habit, and the actual intellect. All right, Article 11, whether the speculative and the practical intellects are distinct powers. He says the speculative and practical intellects are not distinct powers. For it is the speculative intellect, which directs what it apprehends, not to operation, but to the consideration of truth, while the practical intellect is that which directs what it apprehends to operation. This is something that keeps coming back in the Summa. Speculative versus practical, consideration of truth or consideration of operations, right? And this is what the philosopher says, that the speculative differs from the practical in its end. All right, 2 more articles to go. I hope you're still with me. I hope I haven't run you off yet. This is long, but this is all very important. Article 12, whether Synderesis Synderesis is a special power of the soul distinct from the others. Now, I put this lady on here because it's like, who's heard of this word? Synderesis, right? It's very interesting. Synderesis is not a power but a habit. Man's act of reasoning, since it is a kind of movement, proceeds from the understanding of certain things, namely those which are naturally known without any investigation on the part of reason, as from an immovable principle, and ends also in the understanding, inasmuch as by means of those principles naturally known, we judge of those things which we have discovered by reason. So there's some things that we know more naturally and some things we know through the use of our reason. And by the way, let me just real quickly say this. When we get to the intellectual virtues like wisdom and knowledge and understanding and science and art, these are the things, these are acquired virtues that help us to perfect this aspect of us. Therefore, we must have bestowed on us by nature not only speculative principles, but also practical principles. Now, the first speculative principles bestowed on us by nature do not belong to a special power, but to a special habit, which is the understanding of principles. Remember, the contemplation of truth. Wherefore, the first practical principles bestowed on us by nature do not belong to us to a special power, but as a natural habit, which we call synderesis. Now, get this. When synderesis is said to incite to good and murmur at evil, inasmuch as through first principles we proceed to discover and judge of what we have discovered, it is understood that synderesis is not a power but a natural habit. As we look out in the world and we kind of figure things out, and we come to know this is good for me, this is bad, this is evil, this should be shunned, this should be pursued. That is synderesis, and it is a habit. Article 13 is conscience, a power of the soul. Properly speaking, conscience is not a power but an act. For conscience, according to the very nature of the word, implies the relation of knowledge to something. For conscience may be resolved into cum alio scientia, knowledge applied to an individual case. But the application of knowledge to something is done by some act. Wherefore, from this explanation of the name, it is clear that conscience is an act. For conscience is said to witness, to bind, or incite, and also to accuse, torment, or rebuke. Okay, we all know what conscience is. And all these follow the application of knowledge or science to what we do, which application is made in three ways. One way is insofar as we recognize that we have done or not done something. Okay, we know we did something, we didn't do something. Our conscience pricks us, right? In another way, as so far as through the conscience we judge that something should be done or not done. In a third way, insofar as by conscience we judge that something done is well or ill done. And in this sense, conscience is said to excuse, accuse, or torment. Now it is clear that all these things follow the actual application of knowledge to what we do, wherefore, properly speaking, conscience denominates an act. If you are still here, after this long video, congratulations. You made it to the end of what I think is probably, like I said, one of the most important questions in the entire Summa to St. Thomas Aquinas, but he's talking about the most important faculty of the human person, the intellect, and what are the intellectual powers of the soul. If you stuck with me, you have a great understanding of our intellect and how it fits into the big picture of the Summa Theologia. Thank you for watching. Thank you for journeying with me through these questions of the Summa, one at a time. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.